Certainty, as in a clear and present existential threat, is always the first order of business. John has just described a set of overlapping neural subsystems designed to activate and inhibit tendencies, actual behaviors, which can be a much more difficult problem than clear and present dangers. I think of it as an uncertainty processing system. Uncertainty is not just some state that pops up every once in a while, like some kind of hassle we have to deal with sometimes. Everything is always uncertain. It's the deepest, most enveloping characteristic of existence. And so, not surprisingly, we're designed to deal with uncertainty without getting all worked up about it, unless it's worth it. This is what Descartes ceded to God via the soul, dealing with everything that's not reflexive, that involves uncertainty. Personally, I think Descartes was seriously underestimating himself and the rest of us, and overlooking what we already do. Even though it's supposedly the greatest certainty, there's plenty of uncertainty about death, like when or where or how. And most of all, we don't know what, if anything, happens next. Yes, there's some abstract sense of inevitability, but experientially all we know is that a lot of other people have done it. So, while we can be certain in some abstract sense that death will happen to us, we may not be at all familiar with even the idea of it, which is what terror management theory is all about, because most of us have not devoted any of our attention to it, ever. Religions offer certainty relative to death, especially about what happens next, the least testable of the unknowns. And as such, they're a great death anxiety shield and relief mechanism. What makes religion special is that through a narrative about what happens next, religions are able to buffer death anxiety at scale. I know that religion has played this role all over the globe, but for now I'll stick with Western civilization, viewed through the lens of death anxiety, because I think this is where the modern version of the death anxiety dilemma begins, and where in many ways we still are. Descartes, who I talked about earlier, outsourcing uncertain decisions to God, lived and worked during a much larger period of turmoil. It was probably launched easily 100 years earlier when Martin Luther nailed his famous 95 Theses to the door, which almost entirely focused on death anxiety. So at this point, over 1,500 years into the Christian era in most of Europe, the Church had articulated a very, very elaborate special knowledge of the whole afterlife situation, with penance and halfway stations and waiting to be fully purified and ready for eternal life. All of these elements were a big part of it. It was a path to certainty. There may be people listening to this now who genuinely believe the Church's account in all of its detailed rendering. And that's what's important when it comes to death anxiety, not what's true, whatever that means, but what people believe is true. All you had to do was perform certain labor, certain ritual acts, or pay some money, and you could get a guaranteed fast track through that whole waiting station reconciliation phase. These were the indulgences. That's the fast track. That's what's being sold in the picture here. Think of it as long-lasting death anxiety antidote. The 95 Theses were all about death anxiety and Luther's views about dealing with it. Here's two of my particular favorites. Number 37. Any true Christian, whether living or dead, participates in all the blessings of Christ and the Church, and this is granted him by God, even without indulgence letters. Number 66. The treasures of indulgences are nets with which one now fishes for the wealth of men. Here is an actual indulgence. This one says, pray for the King of France and you get 10 days, meaning 10 days less in purgatory while your temporal sins are being worked out. Luther had launched the first open epistemological battle of the Christian era over knowing what happens after we die. Luther thought he had a better idea for treating death anxiety. The Reformation is all about death anxiety and how best to treat it culturally for the good of individuals and for society. Is it all predetermined and we're just walking in ducks? Is it still up in the air? Do our actions affect it? The Catholics counterattacked with the Jesuits, maybe the greatest educators we as a species have ever produced. This was the Counter-Reformation. The new Jesuit group says, no, salvation is a product of free will and how you exercise it. Now, that's actually a scary amount of responsibility and may not serve as a good death anxiety reduction technique, because it's really saying you reduce death anxiety by the way you live your life. This might be the first application of behavioral medicine to death anxiety. Some thought, even some Catholics, that the Jesuits carried it too far, and that salvation was determined not by what we do, but by God's will. That is, no matter how great you live, it's still uncertain what's going to happen. Blaise Pascal was one of these counter-Reformation Jansenists who believed in God and salvation, but as a mathematician, Pascal was curious about the complex and indeterminate side that Descartes had ceded to God. He wondered how well we could anticipate the will of God by calculating it, by using math to see what God sees, or to state it in more modern terms, to use mathematical tools to make useful statements about uncertainty. And why I'm telling this story is partly to show that one of the watershed periods of Western history, the Protestant Reformation, was about how to help people cope with death anxiety at scale. But it also spawned conceptual technologies for managing what death anxiety is mostly about, which is uncertainty. And that's kind of where we are today. We're not aware of our own strengths because we've been enculturated not to be. Pascal was not trying to defeat uncertainty or deny it or make it go away. He was trying to figure out how we can do our best while facing uncertainty squarely. And what he developed was humans first ever consciously, explicitly trying to answer the question, is there a way to compute optimal outcome under uncertain conditions? What's the best thing to do? This is also central to handling mortality salience, because it involves giving up on certainties and then using and relating comfortably to probability as a tool for managing uncertainty and buffering anxiety. It's hard to imagine this, but there was a time, not that long ago, when the concept of probability was substantially unknown, explicitly anyway. That doesn't mean that humans haven't been using probability calculations in determining behavior unconsciously before Pascal, just that we had not yet externalized the capability. Historically, we were on the threshold of one of the greatest waves of entrepreneurship our species had ever known, the voyages of discovery. The bigger the undertaking, the more investors join and share risk together. But what if things don't go as planned, which they almost never do? A fair division of stakes needs to be about the probability of what would have happened. Pascal figured out elegant equations for describing the breakdown of uncertainty into its little pieces, which quickly became a consistently applied tool for figuring out what might happen or what would have happened, and it helped enable the even larger scale pools of capital needed to explore and colonize new worlds. It was a new way of thinking. The early capitalists didn't have to understand the math. They just had to know there was a way to work this stuff out that felt right. You had to be able to think what might be is an area you can make reasonable statements about. Probabilitas, Latin, comes from the same source as probity, which is a measure of authority. In other words, back when this word came into being, things were understood as more likely to happen or to have happened because authority said so. It was a huge breakthrough that we could calculate probability instead of ceding it to authority. But it also opened Pandora's box, because really believing that an absolute authority controlled your death questions and that special priests could intercede on your behalf, that reduced death anxiety for a lot of people. Take that belief system away, and what's there left to tamp down the death anxiety? Nietzsche's God is Dead meme, revived and featured on the cover of Time magazine in August 1966, means, among other things, that the idea of an all-knowing entity is over, except as fiction, because we don't live in an all-knowable universe. We live in a probabilistic universe that cannot be plotted past to future deterministically. That's Nietzsche's assertion anyway. We've been talking about a type of uncertainty that's called aleatory, which is from Latin, to gamble. So it's about the likelihood of uncertain future events. You just can't know it because it hasn't happened yet, like our death. But in the case of things that have already happened, lots of times we also just can't know it completely because of errors in our information or in what we can perceive. Say you had 8,000 different readings on some incredibly far away object in another galaxy, and you know there's some amount of error in every reading. Can you use that information, plus the knowledge of its limits, and determine what the position most likely is? This type of math was first conceived by a man whose name has become quite famous and cutting edge these days, Thomas Bayes, who was a rural English Protestant theologian, lived in the 1700s. It was his essay towards solving a problem in the doctrine of chances that allows us today to use data with errors in it and then make inferences about the true values. That's why Bayes is famous. He started the math that allows us to use a model and the knowledge about our errors and then calculate what is most likely to be true. So this addresses uncertainty not from what is inherently unknowable, like who's going to win the Super Bowl next year, but from our limited knowledge. That's another kind of uncertainty. It's got a name. It's called estimation uncertainty, but we know it better as ambiguity. So what can we study and know? Descartes and Pascal actually argued about this publicly at court, that's gentlemen of course, in the 1660s, which was only about 15 or so generations ago. And Descartes said that only the determinate, the reflexes, are open to the scientific method of reductionist analysis. Pascal argued that the indeterminate can be known as well. Not known in the sense of certainty, but known in the sense of explored and investigated and understood in order to help make uncertainty more manageable. What kind of knowing do you need? How comfortable is anyone living day to day based on probabilities, not certainties? In McLuhan's terms, probability theory is a technology. It externalizes something about ourselves and thus extends it. Like a car externalizes our mobility and extends our legs. Probabilities, especially the ability to reckon the probabilities under uncertainty, reduce uncertainty or the power of uncertainty. Just like a bicycle reduces distance. It doesn't eliminate it, it tames it a bit. Let me see if I can bring this right into a real-life situation we can all relate to. The example of the four-way stop sign. Suppose we get there, like in the picture you see here, at about the same time as the person next to us. Aiming to go across our path without thinking much, we glance and we get some information. We make eye contact, we see their body language, whatever it is. That current info gets used with the existing model from past encounters at four-way stops, and we make an inference. They see I'm first, it'll be safe for me to go, or not. Or sometimes it's, I'm not sure enough, so I'm not doing anything. There's almost never total certainty. Even when someone waves their arms and motions, were they definitely waving at you? What did the gesture mean to them? Usually both of the elements of uncertainty that we've talked about so far are present. I have imperfect knowledge of the total situation, and there's always some irreducible risk as far as knowing what's going to happen. I still might have misinterpreted something. These things happen in a few seconds. We expose ourselves to serious risk driving in front of another car, and we don't think that much about it. I saw this clearly when, after living for many years in Boston, where I developed my almost unconscious internal model of four-way stop experience, it was a unique driving experience there in Boston, and then in a major life and cultural shift, my wife and I moved to Cache Valley in northern Utah, home of the Utah State Aggies, in Logan, a small college town with lots of four-way stop signs. But guess what? People in Utah don't signal or behave or expect me to behave or do anything at four-way stop signs like they do in Boston. It took me months to recalibrate my model so my quick inferences were solid again. But it sure made the elements of that process clear. In this case, it wasn't poor information in the sense of it's raining so I can't see. I could see clearly. But my database about what that meant, the subtlest nuances of it, that was the problem. I think the book by Michael Lewis and the movie with Brad Pitt about Moneyball shows the role of models in our decisions perfectly. How do you evaluate Major League Baseball talent? Or How do you make inferences about who will provide value in the future? What might happen? And according to Descartes, that's God's realm. Experienced baseball evaluators have had heuristics based on a model of a valuable ball player, but it was old and not up to date. Maybe wasn't even correct in the first place. Billy Beane, the general manager of the Oakland Athletics, was one of the first to use statistical techniques to reduce some of the uncertainty about what actually wins baseball games. And thus he had a more valid model of what is a valuable ball player. He made a better model of what value is, and in using it, he literally saw the world differently than the others. And he found undervalued talent no one else saw, and he foraged for it at a bargain. There were still no certainties, but his model enabled better inferences in the uncertainties of a developing baseball player. We also have mental models about death, which may not be serving us any better than the old-style baseball player models are serving the old-school general managers. These models and the levels of the various aspects of uncertainty present form the basis for approaching anyone's death anxiety. Addressing death anxiety means developing new ways of thinking and new ways of seeing in an uncertain world, just as it does in 21st century sports talent evaluation. New ways of thinking and new processes to support that thinking. It means building up muscles that have probably never been the focus of a systematic and focused development program. End-of-life uncertainty processing muscles. Our existing death models include expectations about roughly how long we'll live. Literally, life expectancy is drilled into us as around 70, 70. We also assume a Gaussian or normal distribution assumption about the way things go. In other words, until you're at least 50, it's a fairly long way off, so you don't really need to allocate any attention to it, unless mortality salience makes its way in. We don't need a dedicated mechanism to ward it off and keep it tamped down most of the time. The best way not to be anxious is to shove something way off into the future. And we all have a believable narrative to tell ourselves about why this is okay in the case of death. We've probably got until 70.
Our reassurance comes from the idea of death, like most things, being Gaussian, which statistically it may be, so that's how our expectation gets to be. I've got until about 70. Pareto distributions, like over on the right here, aren't gentle curves where most people get what they're supposed to. They're kind of awkward shapes in which a few people get something really big and almost everyone else doesn't. When it comes to things like big, huge financial events, a few people get a lot of money, generally thought of as a good thing. But if you were going to plot something like, say, misery distribution after Hurricane Katrina, it would look the same way. The really big thing isn't always good. Actually, money isn't always good either. But these are distributions that are, usually caused, like Hurricane Katrina, by some highly improbable, even unpredictable event, sometimes called black swans, for which there's no totally reliable previously existing database. Well, when death comes, it'll be a black swan for you that day. I think it's better to see the world as full of black swans. Better to have a model that sees a model of death that sees the uncertainty about when and where and how as part of every moment. But that doesn't have to cause terror or even its maybe lesser cousin anxiety, because there's ways of thinking that can help us manage that kind of presence.
Models, like Bill Beane's baseball talent model, helps us figure out what to do under conditions of uncertainty, and they create expectations. In fact, that's the point. Life expectancy is part of our own personal end-of-life model, with each of us, of course, as normative in our own minds. This helps make mortality salience an expectancy violation when it's stimulated, for instance, by someone we know dying very much before the age of 70. The study of expectancy violations is a whole field unto itself. Mortality salience is just actually one of many types of expectancy violation. There's a general pattern to them all, and the pattern is some inconsistency emerges between your model's prediction or your model's expectations and your actual experience right now. that precipitates some form of aversive arousal, which is what gets the brain's investigatory mechanisms in gear, the anxiety systems. At this point, there's a bunch of different things that can happen. Probably the most common is to assimilate it. You figure it's just a puzzle, you don't get it right now, but it's not all that threatening. You can live with it. This would be a typical reaction, for instance, to the unexpected too young death of someone close. It gradually fades into the background. This is all a mode of denial. Another denial approach is the affirmation of some other belief. In other words, the way I'll respond to this apparent instance that isn't predicted by my internal model is to turn my attention to what I do believe. And there's a bit more to that because the aversiveness of the aversive arousal calls for some compensatory activity, a palliative compensation. The affirmation itself is palliative. It feels good to think about me and my group who believe like I do. A third approach to an expectancy violation is to accommodate it and thus change the model. That doesn't happen all that much, for good reasons. It shouldn't be too easy to change a model. Mortality salience is interpreted as an expectancy violation for many of us. It precipitates an aversive arousal, not so much because it's unexpected, but because it's unfamiliar and unexpected now. While our own death is definitely expected at some abstract, way off in the future sense, it is never expected at this moment. In an important meta-study by Prulik-Zinslik and Harmon-Jones, terror management theory is just one of many research traditions exploring the general question of expectancy violations. They sum up 30 years of research and describe the neural components that support this common mechanism of detecting inconsistencies. It's centered in, but it's not limited to, the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, and includes all the other parts of the anxiety response system, or the activation-inhibition system that John has described.
This is a chart from the study that goes back to Leon Fessinger's Dissonance Among Cognitives from the late 1950s, with the violation being a knowledge-experience mismatch. Dissonance is the aversive state, and accommodation is the compensation. For Piaget's theory of cognitive development, another item on the chart, a schema experience mismatch is the violation. Disequilibrium is the aversive state, and assimilation or accommodation are compensatory options. But for terror management, the only one on the chart with mortality reminder as the expectancy violation, it isn't terror, it's the potential of terror. Getting a glimpse, that's the aversive arousal right there. But in the TMT research tradition, affirmation is all that's offered. This is what comes out in articles and interviews, is defining how our death story goes. Cling to my closely held beliefs and in-group status. That's it. It's like the elector already predetermined. It's fixed and absolute that there can only be that palliative response. We do not agree. We think that the unfaceable terror can be faced, even embraced. We also think that people whose lives are unnecessarily limited or painful because of death anxiety can be helped, and that it can be done at scale. As Thomas Kuhn shows in Structure of Scientific Revolutions, scientists also see the world through models, and they experience expectancy violations of those models, which are seen as puzzles at first, assimilation, then as anomalies as they build up, and paradigm shifts are usually full of discomfort for most, but they happen. We think it is crucially important that a paradigm shift in death models happens. That would be another way of saying what we believe in.